Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. I'd like to introduce the panel. On the extreme right is Kinley Dorji, who is extremely interested in the development of civil society in Bhutan. Imhasly, who has lived in India for many years, married to an Indian, and certainly will bring a world view to events. Umesh, Anand, who was a journalist, a full-time journalist, and then he evolved into a civil society activist and writer. He runs a magazine called Civil Society, which is now caught on across India and different parts of the world, and is also online. And he has different constructs in civil society than what people like I might have. What I'd like to do is, I'd like to talk a little bit about where civil society becomes useful and where it's not useful, and then pass it on to the panel. The panel is there for about 40 minutes. I'm suggesting that for about 25 minutes, the panel talks one way or the other, and then we throw it open for questions. I'm going to suggest, and it's not a suggestion by you, because civil society is constantly, that civil societies really work best in a democracy. And the founding document for the basis of a civil society is the Constitution. And the moment you say that, you've already locked it into a certain degree of weakness, because societies are evolving, and the Constitution evolves far more slowly. And then we have a situation across the whole country, of 193 countries, and in that we find there are many non-democracies, many pretend democracies, many semi-democracies, and even the democracies that have been there for a good amount of time, such as India. From time to time, we've had suspensions of democracy. And under each of those, the behavior is different. For instance, in the historical part, democracies are only 200 years old. There's nothing new. I'm not talking about nation states of Greece and so on. And before that, there were only monarchies supported by clergies. And there was a nice, cozy relationship. And if you happen to disagree with them, you literally lost your head. Whether it was science, whether it was a modern new thought, whether it was art, whether anything, you would simply lose your head. Look at Galileo Galilei and so many others. In a non-democratic system, in a monarchical system, in a military dictatorship kind of system, if you happen to be a so-called civil society activist, you're more than likely to be treated like an anarchist. You're likely to be chucked into jail. You're likely to lose your life. You're likely to be judged by a kangaroo court and be sentenced to death. Look what's happening in Egypt. In Sarajevo, 1914, some anarchists, some civil service activist threw a bomb, caused about 30 years of wars until life settled down, and the democracies came to become much more strong. So therefore, in a country like India, I'm talking about India briefly, we've seen the emergence, a far greater emergence of civil society through the plethora of political parties that exist on the one hand, through the plethora of media that exists, and now much more so with the plethora of social media. But in addition to that, you have a very large growing middle class, and they essentially broke no nonsense from our rulers. And I would say that one of the roles of civil society is to rhyme with the rising aspirations of the people, even when different from the ruling elite, to translate a sense of freedom and responsibility to ordinary people, and to celebrate ordinary people, and to coalesce them into a movement when the rulers, even if they're elected, are resisting reasonable change. With that, I'm going to toss it to Umesh, and after that we'll go to Kinley and then to Anand.
Okay. 10 years ago, when we started our magazine, we didn't do it as activists, just to correct Siddharth a little bit. We did it as journalists, and that's what I remain today, and what we were then. Now, 10 years ago, in 2003, the word civil society weren't being used in this country. People would look at our masthead and say, well, what does this mean? 10 years down the line, you've seen a whole burst of civil society activism, activity, policies, initiatives, and in a sense we've gone full circle, and we're still asking ourselves, what does civil society mean? Because we don't seem to have gone anywhere using that term or the activity around it. We're still as confused. So it's very important for us as a society and as an economy to try and find a definition for all this activity. What is it? And why do we do it? And how can we do it? There's a lot of history which goes with civil society, and if you want to read all the books, you could fill this room. So there have been guys who've done PhDs and done a whole lot of else on it. And I don't quite agree with Siddharth that you can't do it in a dictatorship, because one of the important stages of civil society actually emerging was in Eastern Europe, where it was used against the Stalinist state. So there have been phases in our history where civil society has played certain roles, and some of them have been in dictatorships, some of them have been in democracies. More interestingly, what civil society can do and mean will vary from country to country, from economy to economy, from society to society. And I think it's important for us to understand that. When we wanted to come up with what should this magazine cover, what should our magazine Civil Society cover, we asked ourselves this very question, that how do we define it? What should it be? And we came up with a very simple definition, which I want to share with you. We said civil society is that space which is beyond our homes, our offices, our formal lives, which we do through interaction. I, as a doctor, a lawyer, a journalist, what is it that I believe in as a citizen of India? What are those 5, 10 things that I can share with a doctor, a lawyer, a person who enters government, and a banker of wealth? To us, that still remains the most effective civil society definition, where you have those 5, 10, 20, or 100 things in which society believes, because then they guide your life in ways in which it takes us all forward. As a journalist who believes in independent media, I move out of organized media to create a different company because I believe in independent media. And I think democracy in our country, our society, needs independent media. You could say that of a doctor, you could say that of a lawyer, and you need many more bankers in India who think that way. So it's the shared pool of ideas, right? It's the shared pool of values in a neutral space, which we all contribute to, irrespective of other characteristics that you may have. So you could be a leftist politician, or you could be someone on the right. Do we agree on those basic principles? What happens when you don't? When you don't, you have a situation in which you have a country run by NGOs. Because you can't have an economy run by NGOs, it's a failed economy. You need an economy run by a government. And when you have an economy which is dominated by NGOs, which have entrenched interests in keeping problems alive, then you've got a really serious problem. So what you do need are governments which work towards those common goals. Now when you compare that, let's say, with Parliament session, how does it work? It works wonderfully. If everybody agrees that there are certain things of inclusion which we need, let's say in financial inclusion, we move to that. We move towards that for legislation. If everybody believes that we need public education in this country, government-funded education, that let's say privatized healthcare is not working, we need to move to these goals. Obviously, these things need to be topped off and worked out in a more sophisticated way. But the fact of the matter is that as a society, we need to move forward. And the best way we could move forward is by looking at that common pool of ideas which takes us on. Pavan, who's here, was the other day mentioning that at another level, we are all friends. That's true. At another level, most politicians are friends. They know each other. They network each other. They all have common backgrounds in certain ways, some personal, some others. It's important to find those common civil society spaces so that time is not lost in an economy which has a huge number of poor people and a great social agenda to complete. It's also important for us, and I'd like to take another minute on this, it's also important for us to understand what is the role of an NGO and who do NGOs speak for. Now there's a lot of criticism about NGOs speaking for, or civil society institutions speaking for the developed North. A lot of this is documented. It goes back to the Washington Consensus. There is and should be a lot of criticism for the fact that a large chunks of people who claim to represent civil society don't necessarily represent the larger interests of civil society or the larger interests of a whole lot of people in this country. And that's very important. We need to look at that. In one example of it, you could see the election result which we've just experienced. Every single civil society leader has lost his deposit or her deposit. Now, you must ask yourself this question, that am I using space and time in this society which is not justified? Or is it justified, and is society looking for another role for me which I am not playing? And does not think that I should actually merit an election or come into government or be an environment minister purely because I raised the issue of a river? These are serious questions before us, and they're not easily understood. But these are some of the insights I can give you after running Civil Society magazine. And I know my time is short. I would like to hand it over.
Thank you. It's a relief to hear Umesh saying that the civil society is hard to define, hard to understand, hard to identify. Because when Mita told me that, asked me to take part in the discussion on civil society, my first question was, what's that? I think we, to get a little perspective, well, democracy is 6 years old, but for a long time, for 100 years, we were a monarchy. And it was a fairly happy society. We were lucky to have good enlightened kings. And the relationship in the monarchy, the relationship between the king and the people, reality was that the king is responsible, father figure responsible for the people. And the people give their reverence to the king. So as citizens, as subjects, you want something, you go to the king, ask the king for it. And the king has to provide, whether it's healthcare, education, whatever. So I think for the same reason, perhaps, and limited exposure, we were a hidden kingdom for centuries. When the Burmese people looked around us, we were actually worried and we were scared about what was happening. It was, even democracy seemed like what we saw was kind of like sort of violence and a lot of unhappiness. And we hear of corruption and all that. And we were also a society very suspicious of NGOs. Very, very loud activists, what are they doing? Like troublemakers, it seemed like to us. So now, here we are, a democracy initiated by the king. And I think that in essence what we are now required to do is to make this transition from being loyal subjects to responsible citizens. So first question, what's that responsibility? And then also I would agree that if we, like many other areas, if we try and download and copy other societies, other countries, we know it's not going to work. So we are at this stage where we are trying to figure out now, okay, what is the role of the citizen? Now, now there is rubbish everywhere. Okay, do we expect, well, the king is not there to, command someone to clean it up anymore. Whose responsibility is it? Now, if the municipal corporation is not doing it, what happens? Shouldn't the citizens, now we're just beginning to ask that, should we not get together do some of this cleaning or pressure the elected leadership to fulfill their responsibility? So we are at that stage, and I think that's at the moment where I'm coming from. And there's to be on a panel, with people from India, media, and all that. I think it's wonderful because we are still, the confusion is also, even our media. Our media is not very clear on what the responsibility is. Sometimes we think it's to oppose, in the previous government we had a very small opposition, so everyone thought, oh, we must all become opposition, fill in that gap. But the alternatives, the thinking which is missing, I think this is, we're at that very interesting stage where we could go either way.
So I'm basically a media man, but I'm not going to talk of the media as a form of civil society. I wanted to actually take a little more of a contrarian view. We all say, and you've heard it, civil society, it's a force for the good. Very often civil society is pitted against the political system and saying, you know, civil society is good, the political system is bad. And I think we need to question that. I want to start with questioning, like Umesh, Siddharth's initial statement, that civil society works best in a democracy. I think I could say civil society works best in a dictatorship. Maybe it doesn't function so well in a dictatorship, but because civil society embodies the democratic idea, it is most necessary to work in a dictatorship. And I could see that when I grew up, and I was a student in Switzerland, strangely enough, civil society started not by criticizing your own government. It started with criticizing forms of dictatorship which we still saw around us in Europe. It was the dictatorship of Franco in Spain. It was the dictatorship of Salazar in Portugal, together with the colonies that Portugal still had, so there was an anti-colonial part in that. It was the apartheid regime in South Africa. And so, in a sense, that was, in a sense, an ideal, because it came from a democratic base, it was in democratic countries, and it directed its force, its anger, at dictatorships. And it became much more complicated when the civil society movement started to criticize its own governments. Namely, I think the main thing was the anti-nuclear movement. You know, the Easter marches in Britain, in Germany, all over the place, in Switzerland too. And from then on, I think it became more complicated. Because after all, and I think it was not clear to me at that point, it only became clear to me here when I was here in India. In a sense, the democratic system subsumes civil society. The democratic political system is an expression of civil society. And so when we have disagreements with our government, we have a system of addressing these disagreements. And I'm just talking of an ideal situation. We have representatives, local representatives, state, provincial representative, central government level representative, to whom we can air these disagreements. So I just want to bring an example which I think has highlighted this complexity, and I'm sure there might be disagreements on what I'm saying, and I'm also not sure that I'm holding this view very strongly, but if you look at India had for the last 10 years during the governments of the Congress something called the National Advisory Council. Now, that National Advisory Council was peopled by NGOs, as you mentioned, ex-government officials, and it came with the chairmanship of the president of the ruling party. And I think here one could see that you had civil society, and of course the Congress, the government, highlighted this aspect. Said here you have civil society at its best because it's able to articulate the concerns of the common man to the government via us. And so they're very proud of that. They didn't look at the converse side, which was how was civil society used by the political system. for its own designs. There are many people who say that this was one of the instruments, one of the tools that the Congress President and the Congress Party used in order to influence or even determine the actions of the government. But what it certainly did, it did invalidate the recourse, the democratic recourse of the citizen to say, hey, listen, these, there's dirt in the city, there's not enough water, all these issues that are of concern, or larger issues like, the location of a nuclear plant. You go to your representative, you write to him, you meet him, and then you articulate your civil society concerns to him. And he has to kind of bring it to the attention of the government or the parliament. Because what it also does, this kind of infiltration, if you like, by the state into civil society actions, it kind of fractures it and also undermines its moral base. And I think you could see that recently it wasn't the state, like in Egypt, it wasn't the state who infiltrated the movement, the Arab Spring movement, but it was certainly a political movement which used the civil society anger for its own purposes, namely the Muslim Brotherhood. And I saw something similar. I think it wasn't really articulated here, and I think that is also significant. What happened in Bangladesh 2 years ago? You suddenly had this upsurge of people getting together in Dhaka and fighting against Islamic or Islamist threat by way of the war crimes that had been perpetrated 1971 and 72. And I must say I was very scared. One, because here you had a civil society movement who was totally oblivious of being used by the government, who had its own goals in having these people from the Jamaat Islami, which was, after all, still a democratic party, to have them executed. And I think it instrumentalized, it used this civil society as a tool to do that. And I think if we had at that time, second thing was that our media, I'm talking of media in India, hardly reflected that concern or that realization. And I was thinking that if it had been the other way around, if the government had been Islamic and these crowds had wanted to have, say, members of the Awami party hanged, you would have sat up and you would have said, no, how can you be? And this is typical Islamic fundamentalism. But because it went against Islamists, we closed our eyes. We didn't realize how we were actually also doing a disservice to our own moral compass, if you like.
Well, thank you. So, I think one thing that becomes clear is that nobody exactly agrees on what civil society is, and civil society at the same time is completely pervasive in every action of a society. There are arguments for and against each and every one. People go to jail. I mean, I'm just giving a simple example of singers in Russia who see riot. They have to go to jail because they're protesting something. Businessmen have been sent away to Siberia. All kinds of depredations happen if there is not a bunch of people who stand up and say no. Whether it's media, whether it's individuals, whether it's society as a whole, whether it's NGOs, whether it's the development of feeling that there's an inevitability. Anand talked about different countries like South Africa, where apartheid was there. Actually, it was the civil society movements in other countries that actually caused a collapse of that. Similarly, in the United States, which is the oldest democracy, it wasn't until the mid-60s that the civil rights movement, and the civil rights movement captures the word civil perfectly, feeling for enfranchisement of the blacks came to be. And now we have a black president, so after 50, 60 years, you do have an equation, an equally distributed opportunity, let us say, that begins to exist. In a similar way, one can argue that the Mandal Commission in India started the rise of the so-called lower castes, whatever we might think about it. And now societies governed, the lower castes seem to be, the leadership seems to be wiped out. I think we have, we have enormous opportunity, even in Bhutan, to grow a civil society, a responsible civil society. Civil society also, according to me, can be misused, as Bernard very aptly explained, and as has been done in many countries. We use civil society for fighting against another nation, whether it's China on one hand or Vietnam. You know, these things keep on happening across the world. Any comments that we throw it over to?
Certainly, actually, I think the important point that Bernard raised was of the NAC. And I think this is something that should engage all of us, because we should ask ourselves that the trend of using civil society as a substitute and a surrogate for the welfare state, right, is perhaps not one that we need in our country.
Yes.
And I think we need to really seriously ponder this, because one is that it gives civil society an artificial power which comes without responsibility, number one. Secondly, it diminishes government in areas where you need government to be accountable and actually deliver. Now, I think what you pointed out is absolutely correct. And if you see the record of the Congress government, it had created a totally false dichotomy between pro-growth and pro-poor policies, and translated that and used that as an attempt to get votes. How? Through freebies. Now, it's the Indian electorate which has seen this. It has elected whoever. I mean, I'm not making a pitch for anyone, right? But please understand the result. It comes out of a realization that this was a false dichotomy between pro-growth and pro-poor, with a freebie thrown in, and an environment in which you are promoting a certain civil society presence as though it's a surrogate for the state. People want the state to function and perform its responsibilities.
Would you like to add anything before we throw it open for questions? Or we can field the questions as they come.
Just wanted to add one thing. I mean, it's in the same vein that we've been talking about. Apart from the damage that something like the NAC did, and I want to point it out again, I hinted at it, it's that it invalidated the role of the politician. And because we bedevil politicians, maybe rightly so, but they're only a reflection of our citizenship in a way. That role of them being worthless, useless, I mean, it's such a cliche now that it's become boring, has been strengthened by this system, because they didn't have a role to play anymore in their own constituencies.
Kinley, would you care to add something?
Yeah, just add one thought for discussion, or even quite a question. We talk about civil society as a presence, as a consciousness. I'm wondering about because we are at such an early stage, and there's risk of misunderstanding. Like, for example, democracy. We are constructing a democracy. Therefore, theoretically, you have the three arms of government, and someone decided, okay, then we said, okay, we need civil society. We need private media, so encourage newspapers, radio stations, we need civil society, and we drafted a Civil Society Act, which drafted from a government perspective perhaps has a more control approach than anything else. So this kind of the experimentation. One group of people once tried to organize a march in, and that was very interesting. Because where did the idea come from? Perhaps from TV. It was what happened in the democracy march. Why do you march? This was to protest against government ineffective district authorities when there was some tsunami washed over the river. Instead of media going down, covering it and really bringing it out, and other people in a small society, like when Prime Minister said, hey, what are you doing about this? We thought it's time to march towards fear of democracy. Those kind of risks.
Umesh, let's look at it open.
Yeah,
Sure. Any questions?
Absolutely.
Now, any questions at all? And he's addressed it to particular people. There's Kinley, Bernard, Umesh, and Siddharth. Please say who we want answering your question.
Thank you for the wonderful presentation. Mine is not a question as such, but a comment as a traditional thinker. Now, whether you talk about democracy, whether you talk about monarchical institution, I think the whole purpose of the system is to think of an outcome of the system. And the outcome of the system, be it a monarchical institution or a democratic system, the outcome is the social well-being of the people. Now, my question is, now if be it a monarchical institution or a democratic system, if the outcome is ensured with minimum chaotic process, would you still say that democracy is the answer to all kinds of problems? Anybody?
Let me just try to address that quickly. The thing is that if it's a monarchy, I'm assuming your question means a monarch decides what's the right thing to do. The problem is just in that a monarch may say it's the right thing to do, but it may not suit the general view. In many cases it may. I think yesterday Robert Yeo talked about Singapore and the Tamilian gentleman who stood up for parliament. Everything's been done right, but I don't have a right to disagree. I don't have a right to have a different view or an alternate view. I think that civil society brings that. Anybody else want to chip in? I hope that means. Menaka.
I thank you for the presentation. We enjoyed it greatly. I have to say I disagree. I'm not sure.
This you, Mike.
I sort of respectfully,
You can be disrespectful. We're a democracy.
it's far too beautiful a country to be disrespectful in this argument. But I respectfully disagree with strands of each of what you've said. So, the National Advisory Council, by all accounts, was highly ineffective and completely uninfluential. And the few members on it who actually wield some influence in India, Roy, for instance, resigned very early on. So I'm very intrigued that you saw that as an effective way to manage the influence of civil society. One would argue that most of the folks in the National Advisory Council didn't really represent dissent with regard to civil society.
Well, very briefly, I think the record is there for everybody to see. I mean, the RTI Act, Norega, I think the Food Security Act, and probably even the Land Acquisition Act. I think historians will bear me out in saying that a lot of that has really been, if not originated with the NEC, then NEC was a great accelerator in that. I don't know whether Umesh...
What the point at least I made,
I think that's just inaccurate. I'm sorry, but...
No, the point that I made was that, of course you need sensitization. Of course you need a pre-legislative process in this country. All these things are needed. Some of the best laws that we've seen recently have come out of large amounts of discussion among groups and people's movements and so on. Wonderful. But understand the dissonance this creates in government when a government does not believe in what is happening. So if you try to superimpose this, right, without actually building it into something that we all accept and believe, that you actually move towards as a goal, as an established movement. With the Congress, it has been a schizophrenic relationship between what is...
What I suggest is,
Sorry.
we can have a discussion afterwards, so there's 4 or 5 questions. Yes, sir.
enjoyed your definition of civil society as creating a pool of ideas, values, which we want to see achieved. Now, what worries me is this, that look, if you look at the manifestos of all the political parties, if you add them up, you'll find that all these ideas are there. So what is it new that we are bringing to the table? I think what really should be the role of civil society, or what it seems to be, is to act as unelected opposition to the government. Well, what are your views on that?
What is the reason for them doing that? Is that what you said?
No, I'm saying that, look, as it is, if you look at the manifestos of all the political parties and add it up,
Yeah.
all the pool of ideas and values that you want are there. So what are we adding to it?
So what are we adding to it? What you're adding to it is a context within which we are reaching to it. Right? And that we've not successfully managed to do, given the shape that our civil society has taken. Say, Indian civil society has evolved through many phases. If you go back, it was didn't have an NGO, but you had a civil society. This is something for much deeper discussion maybe. But in our current form, have we been able to create a space in which we've been representative of enough people in the country, enough needs in this country, and secondly, have we been able to do this without getting bogged down in an NGO format? This is the question I raise.
Krishna?
No, I just want to ask that, there are a lot of discussions about whether democracy is better or dictatorship or theocracy. But when you talk about democracy itself, I just wanted to ask what sort of evolution of democracy can happen. Because people generally just say democracy. But there are various different types. Everything from first past the post to, I believe in Australia, you pick 4 potential candidates. So you get a much clearer idea about what people really want. So any thoughts about how a democracy might evolve?
I'm going to try it, because in Switzerland they have a different model altogether.
Yeah, I think Switzerland is not such a good example because you have such a high degree of common sense, understanding, and acceptance of the other as having a divergent view. But I think one of the key elements, of course, is tolerance. It has been mentioned in various forums here. Tolerance of dissent, tolerance of the others having a dissentient view. And maybe I can just move the discussion and mention another point so that we can look at it from another point of view rather than just the NAC. I'm sorry, it's again India-centric, but I think that's the country which informs us the most. But it's something which is, I think, close to all your hearts, which is the recent Wendy Doniger issue. Now, if you play a devil's advocate, you could easily say what this small group, I don't know, forget the name of the group, says is a civil society opinion. I mean, if we are true to our definition of civil society, we have to also accept opinions, forms of civil society expressions, which are not our own. So then that brings us to the other question. Old question, I think, in Hinduism versus other religions, what do we do with people who are intolerant? How far does the tolerance go in accepting intolerance? Because that is also something that we are, I think, now in the process of discovering much more in India, is the role of the RSS. Even the RSS, you can say, is a civil society organization. It sees itself as such, but of course it doesn't reproduce some core values that we associate with civil society, and we'll have to, as a civil society, make up our minds how we deal with that issue.
I think the question related more to within a democracy, what is the better different model? So if I may just
well, I think one of the evolutionary mechanisms of democracy would be to deal with this question. Because I think that is something which we have been able to do in Switzerland, which has made a very highly successful consensual society, but also a very boring one.
Well, there's only systems which are not debated. Yes, I know. I'm answering your question. That you have a situation where people are debating presidential or parliamentarian. But even within parliamentarian worldwide, there's so many different marginal changes, whether it's first past the post or you have a runoff, and ultimately it becomes more representative. I think the answer to that, and there isn't a clear one, is that if we can create a system that is somehow more representative, because in the Indian system, you can actually put up a candidate against somebody else to break a certain part of the vote, so that somebody with 20% can get elected.
Plus long-term.
That's long-term. Those are all generational things, I think. Pawan, yes.
This time.
I was just taking it one by one, that's all. Yeah,
That's
go ahead.
not a problem. See, first of all, I believe your point on the NSC. I think there needs to be far greater constructive interface between civil society and government. But the NSC is a wrong example to cite because it was a victim of the unsustainable diarchy of government. It does not really kill the idea, but the particular symbolism and instrumentality was wrong. Secondly, I want to ask you, I think India has looked upon, and Indian establishment has looked upon civil society with antagonism, suspicion, and often hostility. So you look upon it as if you are subversive trespassers into areas where you don't belong. And I believe India must have one of the weakest mechanisms and the most complex and cumbersome procedures to enable civil society within the institutional framework. I mean, if you have a philanthropic or altruistic instinct and want to kill it, India is the best incubator. That is point number 2. Thirdly, I don't agree, Umesh, with your statement that people in civil society need not necessarily be porous with politics.
Sorry, it's not necessarily.
Or politics should be impervious to those from civil society. I mean, these are dichotomies or polarities which we have created. If civil society can't win an election, they better learn how to do it. But I refuse to accept that politicians is the preserve of wheeling-dealing politicians who made it their unsavory career.
No, let me clarify, that's not what I intended to say.
And in fact, if you gave the example, Arvind Kejriwal, for instance, I am not talking of a political person, but apolitical. He was earlier saying he will not join politics. He articulated the reasons why he was doing it. Because politics is one of the more powerful instrumentalities of change. And contrary to expectation, he did particularly well in a democratic election. So it doesn't prove the rule either which way.
Now, we have one last question. Beck.
Thank you, sir. Thank you very much. It was really interesting to listen to perspectives from our neighborhood about civil society because, as Mr. Siddharth says, there's a lot of opportunity for us to groom a civil society in Bhutan. First of all, we're not called NGOs, we're called CSOs in Bhutan. And in a country like this, I think for a long time we've been very, very reliant on the state to deliver everything. And we now have an emerging private sector that to an extent is just discovering notions of corporate social responsibility, etc. You know, but we have 38 registered CSOs, and I must confess, I'm from a CSO. Most of us have very different perceptions of what a CSO should be doing. But the rules that govern us actually describe CSOs in Bhutan as being service providers, catering to welfare. So when I listen to you, I think we do, fall prey to the possibility of becoming surrogates just for welfare provision. But I also understand now that, civil society is a space, And I think it's really important in our new democracy that it be given the space to grow, so we have the diversity of opinions to emerge. And it need not just come through the mainstream media, but that, you know, there are people who associate and come together and believe in something, cleaning up Tim Poo or doing whatever it is, but it's important that we commit that. But we drafted our rules before democracy when we had no clue what civil society is.
So you evolve as you go on.
Yes. But my question is, if there was one thing, you know, if you had a chance to go back 20 years or 30 years, and you're going to redefine these rules that Mr. Pavan mentioned, what would you do to create an enabling sort of situation for civil society? For everyone.
Well, just in one word, I would try to contain the fault of bureaucracy. I think bureaucracy is really the enemy of civil society. It's not the politician, it's the bureaucracy. And I think that if we can win the politicians to our side, then that nexus between politicians and bureaucrats, into which we have also forced them, will be broken.
But you can't see a partnership.
No,
Yes.
sorry, I think there's one last question like that. So Nandini, you said you had a hand up? Oh, sorry. We have to end now because the flags are being hoisted from there. But I do think that this discussion needs to be encouraged because we will jointly keep evolving. And that's important. And so I would encourage everyone to grab a copy of Umesh Anand's Civil Society magazine as a method of seeing how one part of civil society in India functions. Thank you.